The people who laugh the loudest are often the least prepared for the truth. The crystal chandeliers cast warm gold across the ballroom, reflecting off polished marble floors and glasses filled with sparkling wine. Laughter drifted through the room like expensive perfume. Every table was occupied by executives, investors, and socialites dressed in tailored suits and designer gowns. It was the kind of event where everyone wanted to be seen. Claire Bennett paused just inside the entrance. For a brief moment, she considered turning around. Not because she was afraid, not because she regretted coming, but because she knew exactly what kind of people were in this room. She knew how quickly smiles could become whispers, how curiosity could become judgment. Still, she straightened her shoulders and stepped forward. Her navy blue dress was elegant without being flashy. Her blonde hair rested neatly over one shoulder. She carried no designer handbag covered in logos, no diamond necklace large enough to announce wealth. There was something quieter about her now, something steadier. A few guests recognized her immediately. Conversations softened. Eyes followed her across the ballroom. Some looked surprised. Others looked entertained. Claire ignored all of them. She walked calmly toward the reception area, offering polite smiles when necessary. Then she heard a familiar voice. "Well, this is unexpected." Claire turned slowly. Vanessa Hart stood near the center of the room, one hand wrapped around a wine glass. Her white gown shimmered beneath the lights. Standing beside her, Jason Bennett looked slightly uncomfortable, though not uncomfortable enough to say anything. Vanessa's lips curved into a smile that never reached her eyes. "I didn't realize former wives were invited to events like this." A few nearby guests laughed politely. Claire met Vanessa's gaze. She said nothing. Vanessa took a small step closer. "Honestly, Claire, I admire your confidence. Most people would avoid a room full of reminders." More laughter. Jason glanced at Claire before looking away. The movement lasted less than a second, but Claire noticed it. She noticed everything. Years ago, that look might have hurt her. Tonight, it simply confirmed what she already knew. Vanessa swirled the wine inside her glass. "Then again, maybe you just wanted to see what success looks like." Several guests exchanged amused glances. Claire could almost hear the assumptions forming inside their heads. Divorced woman. Forgotten wife. Failed marriage. She remained perfectly still. The silence seemed to frustrate Vanessa more than any response could have. "No comeback?" Vanessa asked. "I expected at least a little bitterness." Claire offered a faint smile. "You seem to be speaking enough for both of us." The answer was calm, almost gentle, but it landed harder than anger. For a moment, Vanessa's expression tightened. Then she laughed, still pretending to be classy. Some things never change. She lifted her glass again. As she turned toward a nearby group, her elbow moved suddenly. Red wine splashed across the front of Claire's dress. The deep crimson stain spread across the navy fabric. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Then came silence. Not shocked silence. Curious silence. The kind that waits to see what happens next. Vanessa placed a hand over her mouth. "Oh my God," she said, though her voice carried no real concern. "How clumsy of me." Nobody missed the satisfaction hiding behind her smile. Claire looked down at the stain. For a second, she simply stared at it. Then she reached for a napkin from a passing tray and calmly dabbed the fabric. No panic, no tears, no raised voice. The room seemed confused by her composure. Vanessa appeared even more disappointed. She had expected a reaction, a scene, something she could use. Instead, Claire continued cleaning the dress as if spilled wine were the least important thing that had happened in her life. Across the ballroom, near the far corner, a man quietly set down his glass. Few people noticed him. Fewer still recognized him immediately. He had been sitting alone throughout most of the evening, observing more than speaking. His dark suit carried no visible signs of status. Yet there was something about the way people unconsciously made space around him. Something about the confidence that required no display. His eyes remained fixed on Claire. Not Vanessa. Not Jason. Claire. He watched the way she handled humiliation without surrendering her dignity. He watched the way she refused to give the crowd the spectacle they wanted. For the first time that evening, the man rose from his chair. Claire never saw him stand. She was still wiping the stain from her dress when a strange feeling settled over the room. Conversations faded. Laughter disappeared. Somewhere beyond the crowd, something had shifted. And although Vanessa was still smiling, She had no idea that the worst mistake of her evening had already been made. The room remained strangely quiet after the spill. Not because anyone felt sorry for Claire Bennett. Most of them were simply waiting. Waiting to see whether she would finally break. Waiting to see whether years of whispered rumors, public assumptions, and private humiliation would finally crack the calm expression she carried so effortlessly. Claire folded the wine-stained napkin and placed it on a nearby tray. Her dress was damaged, but her composure was untouched. That seemed to disappoint several people. Across the ballroom, conversations slowly resumed, though not as loudly as before. The atmosphere had changed. Something invisible now hovered beneath the polished smiles and practiced laughter. Vanessa Hart felt it too. She glanced around the room and noticed fewer people were paying attention to her than she expected. Somehow, despite becoming the target of embarrassment, Claire had become the center of attention. Vanessa hated that. She took another sip of wine and leaned closer to a group of guests. "I suppose some people just cannot let go of the past," she said loudly enough for Claire to hear. A few guests chuckled politely. Others simply watched. Claire did not react. She walked toward the refreshment table near the windows overlooking the city skyline. 40 floors below, streams of headlights moved through the streets like ribbons of light. She wrapped her fingers around a glass of sparkling water and looked out across the city. New York always looked different from above. Smaller somehow. Less intimidating. The silence gave her a moment to breathe. Then a voice interrupted her thoughts. "You seem surprisingly calm." Claire turned slightly. A woman she vaguely recognized from years earlier offered a curious smile. Most people would have left already. Claire looked back toward the city lights. Most people have not spent years learning what deserves their energy. The woman blinked, caught off guard by the answer. Before she could respond, another guest approached. Then another. Soon several people stood nearby, pretending to admire the view while quietly studying Claire. It was subtle, but she understood exactly what was happening. They were trying to solve a puzzle. Why was she here? That question had been floating around the ballroom since the moment she arrived. Why would Jason invite his former wife to such an important event? Why would Claire actually accept? The answers seemed obvious to everyone. They assumed she came out of curiosity, regret, nostalgia, maybe even loneliness. But none of those reasons were true. Claire had known exactly what kind of evening this would become before she walked through the doors. She knew Vanessa would perform for the crowd. She knew Jason would stay silent. She knew people would judge her without knowing anything about her life. Yet she had come anyway. Because this evening was never about Jason. And it certainly was not about Vanessa. Near the center of the ballroom, Jason adjusted his tie and watched Claire from a distance. For the first time that night, uncertainty crossed his face. Something felt different. During their marriage, Claire had always been easy to read. He knew when she was hurt. He knew when she was disappointed. He knew when she was struggling to hide her emotions. Tonight, he could not read her at all. That unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Meanwhile, at the far corner of the room, the man who had stood up earlier remained silent. Ethan Cole observed everything without drawing attention to himself. Most guests had not noticed him rise from his seat. Those who recognized him assumed he was simply stretching his legs or preparing to leave. None of them realized he had changed his position for a reason. His eyes occasionally returned to Claire. Not with pity, not with concern, with respect. The kind of respect that is earned long before anyone notices it. Claire never looked in his direction. She remained focused on the skyline beyond the glass. Yet an unusual detail finally caught her attention. Near the stage at the front of the ballroom stood a table reserved for only a handful of people. Executives, investors, industry leaders. A small card rested on one of the chairs. From where she stood, Claire could not read the name. But she could see one thing clearly. The seat remained empty, reserved, waiting. And for reasons she could not yet explain, she had the strange feeling that the empty chair had something to do with her. Claire continued staring at the reserved chair near the stage. The white card resting against the crystal water glass remained too far away to read, yet something about it refused to leave her thoughts. Around her, the ballroom slowly returned to its rhythm. Servers moved between tables carrying silver trays. Soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers. Laughter returned in scattered bursts. But beneath the polished surface, curiosity was spreading. More people were beginning to notice the empty seat. More importantly, they were beginning to notice Claire. She felt their attention without looking at them. Years ago, That attention would have made her uncomfortable. Back then, she spent too much time worrying about what others thought. She had spent years trying to make everyone comfortable, years trying to be supportive, understanding, patient, the kind of woman who held everything together while standing quietly in the background. Most people never noticed that kind of work. They only noticed the person standing at the top when success finally arrived. Jason certainly had. From across the ballroom, he watched Claire speaking briefly with a few guests. It bothered him more than he expected. When he first sent the invitation, he assumed she would refuse. If she came, he assumed she would stay hidden near the edges of the room. He certainly did not expect people to gravitate toward her. He especially did not expect her to appear completely unaffected by Vanessa's attempts to embarrass her. For the first time all evening, he began wondering whether inviting Claire had been a mistake. Vanessa noticed his expression. "You are not actually worried about her, are you?" she asked quietly. Jason forced a smile. "Of course not." Vanessa glanced toward Claire. "Good. Because she is clearly trying to attract attention." Jason did not answer. Something about the accusation felt wrong. Claire was doing the exact opposite. She was not demanding attention. She was not telling stories about the past. She was not defending herself. Somehow that made her impossible to ignore. Near the windows, another guest approached Claire. An older investor she vaguely recognized from years before. "Forgive me if this sounds personal," he said carefully, "but many of us were surprised to see you here tonight." Claire smiled politely. "I gathered that." The man laughed softly. "People have been asking the same question all evening." Claire took a sip of water. "And what question is that? Why would you come?" The answer could have been complicated. It could have included years of history, sacrifice, disappointment, reinvention. Instead, Claire simply looked across the room. Because sometimes walking into a room is easier than spending years avoiding it. The investor nodded slowly. He seemed to understand more than she had actually said. As he walked away, Claire once again noticed movement near the stage. A hotel employee approached the reserved table. The employee carefully adjusted the chair, checked the place settings, and then left. The seat remained empty. Waiting. The strange feeling returned. It was impossible to explain. Almost like standing near the beginning of a conversation she had not yet heard. Meanwhile, Ethan Cole remained observant from a distance. He had attended countless corporate events over the years. He understood people well. Success had taught him many things, but one lesson stood above the rest. Character revealed itself most clearly when people believed no consequences existed. Tonight he had watched Vanessa reveal hers. He had watched Jason reveal his. And Claire had revealed hers without even trying. A sudden announcement interrupted the room. One of the event organizers stepped onto the stage and tapped the microphone. Conversations gradually faded. Guests began returning to their assigned tables. The evening's formal program was about to begin. Claire glanced around the ballroom. Her eyes followed the movement of guests taking their seats. Then she froze. A member of the hotel staff was walking directly toward her. The young woman carried a small envelope. "Ms. Bennett?" she asked politely. Claire looked surprised. "Yes." The woman handed her the envelope with both hands. "This was left for you." Several nearby guests immediately noticed. Curiosity flashed across their faces. Claire looked down at the cream-colored envelope. No return address. No explanation. Just her name written neatly across the front. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she opened it. Inside was a single card containing only 7 words. "Your seat is waiting. Please join us." Claire slowly lifted her eyes toward the stage, toward the reserved chair that had remained empty all evening. And for the first time since arriving, she realized that seat had never been empty at all. It had been reserved for her. For several seconds, Claire Bennett simply stared at the card in her hand. Around her, the ballroom seemed to blur into a distant hum. "Your seat is waiting. Please join us." The words were simple, yet they carried a weight she could not explain. She looked once more toward the reserved chair near the stage. Now that she knew it was intended for her, the entire evening suddenly felt different. Questions she had ignored began surfacing. Who had arranged this? Why had nobody mentioned it? And perhaps most importantly, why her? Nearby guests noticed her hesitation. Some watched openly. Others pretended not to. Curiosity spread through the room faster than conversation. Claire folded the card carefully and slipped it into her clutch. Then she began walking. Every step toward the stage seemed to draw more attention. Conversations faded as people followed her movement. Vanessa noticed first. Her smile slowly disappeared. "What is she doing?" she asked under her breath. Jason followed Claire with his eyes. His confusion mirrored everyone else's. He had reviewed the guest list personally. He had approved seating arrangements. He knew exactly who was supposed to sit at the executive table. Claire was not one of them. At least she was not supposed to be. Yet the hotel staff standing near the stage immediately stepped aside as she approached. One employee even pulled the chair back respectfully. The gesture was subtle but impossible to miss. Claire stopped beside the seat and glanced at the name card. Her heart skipped. It did not contain a company title. It did not mention an organization. It simply displayed her name. Claire Bennett. Nothing more. Nothing less. As though that alone was enough. The realization sent an unexpected wave of emotion through her. For years she had been introduced through someone else. Jason's wife. Jason's former wife. The woman behind Jason's success. The woman Jason left. Every label attached her identity to another person. Tonight, for the first time in a very long time, she saw only her own name. A voice interrupted the moment. "You should sit down." Claire turned. Standing a few feet away was the same hotel employee who had delivered the envelope. The young woman smiled politely. "The program is about to begin." Claire nodded and took her seat. Instantly, the atmosphere shifted again. Guests exchanged confused looks. Several executives whispered among themselves. Nobody understood what was happening. That uncertainty made people nervous. Across the room, Vanessa forced a laugh. "This is ridiculous," she said to a nearby guest. "There must be some mistake." But even she sounded less certain than before. Jason remained silent. Something about the situation bothered him. Deeply. The seat was not random. He could feel that much. Someone had planned this. Someone important. At the far end of the executive table, Ethan Cole watched quietly. His expression never changed. He did not wave. He did not acknowledge Claire publicly. In fact, he behaved as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Yet his calm confidence seemed to confirm one thing. The evening was unfolding exactly as he expected. The event organizer returned to the stage. The microphone crackled softly before his voice filled the ballroom. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight." Applause followed. Claire listened while occasionally feeling the eyes of the room drift back toward her. The wine stain remained visible on her dress. Under different circumstances, she might have felt embarrassed. Instead, it no longer seemed important. For reasons she could not fully explain, the humiliation from earlier felt distant now. Smaller, almost irrelevant. As the presentation continued, large screens illuminated behind the stage. Images from the company's growth appeared one after another. New offices, expansion announcements, corporate milestones. Guests applauded at familiar achievements. Then one photograph appeared that caused Claire to freeze. It was old, very old, taken years before the company became successful. In the image, a much younger Jason stood inside a tiny rented office. Beside him stood Claire. They were smiling, surrounded by folding tables, secondhand furniture, and handwritten plans taped to the walls. The audience saw only a historical company photo. Claire saw something else. She saw years of sacrifice, sleepless nights, missed holidays, dreams built from nothing. For the first time all evening, a murmur spread through the ballroom. People looked from the screen to Claire, then back to the screen. The connection was becoming impossible to ignore. And somewhere inside the room, several people were beginning to realize they did not know the true story at all. The photograph remained on the screen longer than any of the others. It should have been an insignificant image from the company's early years, yet it seemed to hold the attention of the entire ballroom. Claire sat quietly as whispers moved from table to table. People who had never paid attention to her before were now looking at her differently. Not with sympathy, with curiosity. They were beginning to realize there was a chapter missing from the story they thought they knew. The presentation continued, but Claire barely heard it. Her eyes remained fixed on the image of that tiny office. She remembered every detail. The stained carpet, the folding chairs purchased from a closing supply store, the old coffee machine that worked only when someone hit the side twice. Back then, success had felt impossibly far away. Yet those had been some of the happiest days of her life. Not because they had money. They did not. Not because life was easy. It was not. They were happy because they believed they were building something together. A sudden memory surfaced. One rainy October morning years earlier, Claire had arrived at a small coffee shop carrying a laptop and a stack of invoices. She had spent the previous night helping Jason prepare investor presentations. Exhausted, she ordered the cheapest coffee on the menu and sat near the window. The shop was nearly empty. She remembered spreading documents across the table and trying to solve a cash flow problem that threatened to derail everything. Then a stranger had asked whether the empty chair across from her was available. Claire had looked up and seen a man wearing a simple dark coat. Polite, professional, unremarkable in the best possible way. Ethan Cole. Of course, she had not known his name then. To her, he was simply a customer looking for a seat. Over the following weeks, their paths crossed repeatedly. Sometimes they exchanged a few words. Sometimes they discussed business ideas. Occasionally they debated books, leadership, or the strange ways people changed after achieving success. Ethan never introduced himself as a billionaire executive. He never mentioned magazine covers, corporate boards, or private jets. He listened far more than he spoke. And somehow, without realizing it, Claire found herself looking forward to those conversations. Not because he impressed her, because he treated her as though her thoughts mattered. Back in the ballroom, another slide appeared on the screen. Then another. The audience applauded politely. Yet many people were no longer focused on the presentation. Their attention kept drifting toward Claire. Vanessa noticed it too. Every minute seemed to make her more uncomfortable. The evening was moving in a direction she could not control. "Why is everyone looking at her?" she whispered. Nobody answered. Jason remained unusually quiet. Deep down, he already knew why. The room was beginning to discover something he had spent years trying not to think about. Success stories often celebrated the person standing in front of the camera. They rarely acknowledged the person who stood beside them before anyone was watching. Suddenly, the event organizer returned to the microphone. "Before we continue," he said with a smile, "there is one guest whose presence tonight deserves special recognition." The ballroom immediately grew silent. Vanessa straightened in her chair. Jason adjusted his jacket. Several executives exchanged confident looks. Everyone assumed the recognition would go to a major investor or industry leader. Claire felt no anticipation at all. She simply folded her hands in her lap and listened. Then the organizer glanced toward the executive table, toward the seat where Claire sat. And for the second time that evening, an invisible wave of surprise swept through the room. The silence that followed felt heavier than any applause. The event organizer looked directly toward Claire Bennett while hundreds of guests waited for an explanation. Even the servers had paused. The ballroom seemed suspended between confusion and anticipation. Claire felt every eye in the room settle on her. Yet she remained calm. Years ago, attention like this would have made her nervous. Tonight it felt different. Not comfortable, just strangely familiar, as though she had unknowingly been walking toward this moment for a very long time. The organizer smiled warmly. "Some contributions are measured in numbers," he said. "Others are measured in sacrifices nobody sees." The words echoed through the ballroom. Several people shifted in their seats. Jason lowered his eyes. Vanessa folded her arms. Neither of them liked where this was going. On the giant screens behind the stage, another image appeared. Then another. Unlike the earlier corporate milestones, these photographs focused on the beginning. Long nights, early planning sessions, small rented spaces, handwritten notes. A journey most people had forgotten. But Claire remembered every moment. She remembered carrying boxes through snow-covered parking lots. She remembered balancing household bills while helping prepare presentations. She remembered encouraging Jason after investors rejected proposal after proposal. Back then there were no headlines, no awards, no luxury events, only hope and hard work. The organizer continued speaking. Every successful story has chapters that never make it into public biographies. Murmurs spread across the room. More guests were beginning to understand. Not completely, but enough. Vanessa glanced at Jason. "What exactly is this?" she whispered. Jason did not answer. His jaw tightened. Because unlike everyone else, he knew exactly what the photographs represented. They represented years he had stopped talking about. Years he preferred to leave behind. Across the executive table, Ethan Cole watched quietly. His expression remained unreadable. He neither encouraged the attention nor avoided it. He simply observed. Claire noticed him briefly. Their eyes met for less than a second. Yet something about that moment steadied her. It reminded her of countless conversations inside that small coffee shop years earlier. Ethan had always possessed a rare ability. He made people feel seen without demanding anything from them. The organizer glanced toward the audience again. There is someone here tonight who helped build the foundation beneath many of the achievements we celebrate today. The room became even quieter. Several guests now openly stared at Claire. Some appeared embarrassed. Earlier they had laughed when Vanessa mocked her. Earlier they had watched her humiliation as entertainment. Now uncertainty was replacing confidence. Nobody enjoys realizing they judged someone too quickly. Claire felt none of the satisfaction she once imagined such a moment might bring. Surprisingly, she did not want revenge. She did not want apologies. She only wanted peace. The organizer looked down at a card in his hand, then back at the audience. Before we continue, there is a guest who specifically requested this recognition happen tonight. That statement triggered another wave of whispers. Heads turned throughout the ballroom. Investors exchanged curious glances. Executives leaned forward. Even Vanessa looked concerned now. Whoever had arranged this evening clearly possessed significant influence. Otherwise, none of this would be happening. Claire's heartbeat quickened slightly. For the first time all night, she found herself wondering the same thing as everyone else. Who was behind this? The answer felt close. Close enough to touch, yet still hidden. Then the organizer smiled. I believe it is time for him to speak for himself. Every face in the ballroom turned in the same direction. Toward the executive table. Toward the man who had spent most of the evening sitting quietly in the background. Ethan Cole slowly rose from his chair. Gasps immediately swept across the room. Several guests nearly dropped their glasses. Others stared in disbelief. Because unlike Claire, they recognized him instantly. Not as a stranger from a coffee shop. Not as a quiet observer. But as one of the most influential chief executive officers in the country. And as Ethan stepped away from the table and began walking toward the stage, Vanessa's confidence finally disappeared completely. Ethan Cole's footsteps seemed louder than the music that had filled the ballroom all evening. Not because he was trying to command attention. He did not need to. The moment people recognized him, the atmosphere changed completely. Conversations disappeared. Executives straightened in their seats. Investors who had spent years trying to secure meetings with him suddenly found themselves only a few yards away. Claire watched him approach the stage with quiet disbelief. She knew Ethan as the thoughtful man from the coffee shop, the patient listener, the person who never interrupted, the person who remembered small details others overlooked. She had always known he was successful. She had never understood just how successful. Ethan reached the podium and thanked the organizer with a simple nod. The room remained silent. Hundreds of people waited for him to speak. Yet when he finally did, his voice was calm and unhurried. Good evening. That was all it took. Every person in the ballroom seemed to lean forward. Ethan glanced briefly across the audience before his eyes settled on Claire. Not dramatically, not theatrically, just naturally. As though she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Success has an interesting relationship with memory, he said. The higher people climb, the easier it becomes to forget who helped build the ladder. The statement landed heavily. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. Jason stared at the table in front of him. Vanessa remained perfectly still. Ethan continued. I have spent decades meeting founders, executives, innovators, and entrepreneurs. I have learned that behind almost every success story is someone whose contributions never appear in headlines. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. She knew exactly where this was heading. Ethan was not speaking about business anymore. He was speaking about people, about character, about truth. Another photograph appeared behind him. The same small office, the same folding tables, the same younger version of Claire and Jason standing side by side. Ethan looked at the image. Years ago, before many people in this room knew this company existed, there was a woman helping carry its weight. No names yet. No dramatic reveal. Yet everyone already understood. The ballroom felt smaller with every passing second. Ethan smiled slightly. I know this because I listened to her. That statement triggered immediate confusion. People exchanged puzzled looks. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken. Ethan rarely spoke about himself. Hearing him publicly reference their conversations felt unexpectedly personal. Long before I knew the scale of her sacrifices, he continued, I knew her perspective, her integrity, her work ethic. I knew how she approached challenges when nobody was watching. He paused, and I knew she never took credit for things she could have claimed as her own. Jason closed his eyes briefly. The words struck harder than any direct accusation ever could. Because they were true. Ethan finally turned toward Claire. The gesture was gentle, almost respectful. Claire Bennett. Her name echoed through the ballroom. Not as a former spouse. Not as a footnote in someone else's story. Simply her name. Claire looked up. Every person in the room was watching her now. Ethan's expression softened. You once told me that some of the most important work in life happens where nobody can see it. Claire remembered the conversation immediately. A rainy afternoon. A coffee shop window covered in droplets. A discussion about recognition and purpose. She never imagined he would remember those words years later. Ethan smiled. I never forgot. The room grew even quieter. Some guests appeared embarrassed. Others looked thoughtful. The laughter from earlier in the evening now felt impossibly distant. Ethan stepped away from the podium. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then something unexpected happened. A few people began applauding. Slowly at first. Then more joined. Then more. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was standing. Not for a corporate milestone. Not for a business achievement. For Claire. She sat frozen as the applause surrounded her. Across the room, Vanessa looked stunned. Jason looked defeated. And for the first time all evening, the crowd that had once watched her humiliation was now rising to its feet in respect. The applause continued far longer than anyone expected. Claire Bennett remained seated for several moments, overwhelmed not by the attention itself, but by what it represented. Respect, recognition, truth, things she had stopped expecting years ago. Around the ballroom, people slowly returned to their seats, though the atmosphere had permanently changed. The room that had once viewed her as an outsider was now looking at her through entirely different eyes. Ethan Cole remained standing near the stage. He waited patiently until the applause faded. Then he spoke again. There is one more thing I would like to share. Instantly, the room became silent. Claire felt a strange sense of anticipation. Ethan's expression was calm, but there was something deliberate in his voice now. Something final. Many people believe success is measured by what we build after we are recognized, he said. I have found the opposite is often true. Character is built long before recognition arrives. Several guests nodded thoughtfully. Others listened with increasing curiosity. Ethan turned slightly toward Claire. The first time I met Claire, she was sitting alone in a small coffee shop reviewing financial documents. A few surprised looks spread across the room. Ethan rarely spoke publicly about his personal life. The fact that he was sharing this story made everyone pay even closer attention. She did not know who I was, he continued. And because she did not know who I was, she had no reason to impress me. A faint smile appeared on his face. That is exactly why I was impressed. Soft laughter moved through the audience. Ethan continued. Over the years, I watched her rebuild her life with extraordinary dignity. Not because everything went her way. Because it did not. Not because people always treated her fairly. Because they did not. She simply chose not to become bitter. Claire lowered her gaze briefly. Hearing someone describe her journey out loud felt strangely vulnerable. Ethan looked across the ballroom. In a world where many people chase attention, she focused on growth. In a world where many people seek revenge, she pursued peace. The silence that followed carried more weight than applause ever could. Several guests appeared emotional. Others seemed deeply reflective. Then Ethan smiled. Which brings me to the real reason I am here tonight. The tension in the room immediately returned. Even Vanessa leaned forward. Everyone sensed another revelation approaching. Ethan glanced toward the company's executive team. 6 months ago, my organization began evaluating strategic partnerships for a major national expansion project. Several executives exchanged surprised looks. This was serious business. The kind of opportunity companies competed for years to obtain. Ethan continued. During that evaluation process, I reviewed leadership records, corporate culture reports, and company histories. Jason's face grew noticeably tense. He knew exactly what Ethan was referring to. Ethan's organization controlled opportunities capable of transforming entire industries. The review taught me something important, Ethan said calmly. A company's future is often revealed by how it treats the people who helped create its past. No accusation. No raised voice. Yet the statement struck the room like a thunderclap. Jason looked down. Vanessa remained motionless. Ethan paused briefly. As a result of that review, several partnership decisions were made. Guests exchanged nervous glances. Nobody knew where this was leading. Then Ethan turned fully toward Claire. His voice softened. "Claire, years ago you told me something else I never forgot." Claire looked up. Ethan smiled warmly. "You said that eventually life introduces you to rooms where you no longer need to prove your worth." The memory returned instantly. Another conversation. Another afternoon. Another piece of wisdom she had spoken without realizing anyone would remember. Ethan nodded. "You were right." Then he extended his hand toward her. Not dramatically, not romantically, simply with genuine respect. "Welcome to one of those rooms." The ballroom fell completely silent. And in that moment, every person present understood the truth. Ethan Cole had not stood up because Claire needed saving. He stood up because someone finally needed to acknowledge what had always been there. For a moment, nobody moved. Ethan Cole's hand remained extended toward Claire Bennett, not demanding attention, not creating a spectacle, simply offering acknowledgement. The kind she had deserved years ago. Claire looked at him and smiled softly before accepting the gesture. The applause did not return. It did not need to. The silence inside the ballroom had become something entirely different from the silence earlier that evening. Before, it had been the silence of judgment. Now it was the silence of reflection. Ethan helped her to her feet and then stepped aside. The gesture was small but meaningful. He was not placing himself in front of her story. He was making room for it. Claire stood calmly beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers. The wine stain remained visible on her dress. Earlier it had felt like a symbol of humiliation. Now it looked almost insignificant. Around the room, people who had laughed, whispered, or looked away when Vanessa mocked her found themselves unable to meet her eyes. Not because Claire demanded anything from them, because dignity has a way of holding up a mirror. Near the back of the ballroom, several guests quietly approached one another, discussing memories they had overlooked, stories they had never bothered to ask about, details they had assumed were unimportant. Jason Bennett remained seated. The confidence that had surrounded him earlier in the evening was gone. He looked toward Claire, then toward the photographs still displayed on the screens behind the stage. For years he had convinced himself that the past belonged in the past. Yet tonight, every forgotten sacrifice had returned. Not as accusations, as reminders. The hardest truths are often the quietest ones. Vanessa Hart sat motionless. The room no longer revolved around her. The attention she had chased all evening had vanished. Not because anyone attacked her, because the spotlight naturally moved towards something more meaningful. For the first time, she seemed to understand that public admiration and genuine respect were not the same thing. Claire noticed neither of them for very long. She felt no desire to celebrate their discomfort. That chapter of her life had already ended. Ethan returned to the microphone one final time. "There are evenings that change business relationships," he said. "And there are evenings that remind us what matters more than business." His gaze moved across the audience. Tonight was one of those evenings. No dramatic announcement followed. No public punishment. No humiliation. Just a simple truth left hanging in the air. The kind people carry home with them. The formal program concluded shortly afterward. Guests began standing, gathering coats, exchanging quiet conversations. Yet something unusual happened as Claire prepared to leave. One by one, people approached her. Some offered congratulations. Others offered apologies without using the word. A few simply thanked her for being there. Claire accepted each interaction with grace. She did not linger on the past. She did not correct anyone. She simply listened. When the crowd finally began to thin, she made her way toward the ballroom entrance. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights stretched endlessly across the night. Ethan walked beside her. Neither spoke for several moments. They did not need to. The elevator lobby waited just beyond the doors. As they reached the exit, a hotel attendant stepped forward and opened the door for them. Claire paused briefly and glanced back at the ballroom. Hours earlier, she had entered that room carrying the weight of old assumptions. She had been viewed as a footnote in someone else's success story. Now she saw something entirely different. Not victory. Freedom. The freedom that comes when other people's opinions no longer define your worth. She smiled to herself and turned away. Beside her, Ethan pressed the elevator button. The doors opened with a soft chime. Together they stepped inside. As the elevator descended toward the city below, the ballroom and everything it represented slowly disappeared from view. Claire did not win Jason back. She did not defeat Vanessa. She did not reclaim the past. She achieved something far more valuable. She reclaimed herself. And sometimes, that is the only ending that truly matters.